Our next speaker will be Professor William Nierenberg. Professor Nierenberg is one of America's most eminent senior scientists with a career spanning from the Manhattan Project to director of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. It's a great privilege to have him speak with us. Thank you.
I'm just having my batteries changed. Thank you very much. You're a very lucky audience. You've heard two very remarkable speakers today, more than that, but two that I'm talking about. Unfortunately, because of the fact that two runways in the airport here are not more than 4,000 feet apart, anytime there's a cloud over the San Francisco airport, the situation is hopeless. I was 3 hours late in coming up from San Diego. And so I missed Professor Singer's talk, Dr. Singer's talk, but I did read it. And, you know, it seems to me in the last few years, every time I get up to speak, I start off by apologizing. Two talks are almost identical, item for item. Even some of the nuances are the same in the talk, but there is a difference in viewpoint. And in a way, I'm rather happy that he made those points out of many he could have made, and that they are identical to mine, because I'm going to use them for a totally different purpose. And my title, as you know, is If You Can't Trust the New York Times, Whom Can You Trust? Now, I have to say, and bear with me, this is an experimental talk. I have in mind writing a book on the subject, but this would be, in effect, one chapter of the book. And it came to me only recently, and is based on articles in the New York Times on the subject of global warming over the last 15 years or so. The peculiar and special nature of the twist given the subject by that noble newspaper didn't sink into my consciousness until a number of years had gone by. Hence I didn't think of making a file of the individual articles until it was too late to do so easily. Let me say very quickly, on the computer, you can go back to about 1996. Before that, you have to go to the library and laboriously go over page by page. If my plans do work out, I do have support for extracting the articles I want to get out. So it's also not complete for another reason. As I say, I don't have the individual articles to buttress my analysis, but my memory is good enough to pretty much bring out the points I want to bring today. The idea that a newspaper like the New York Times could carry a clear bias over such a long period of time it was a big surprise to me. It didn't hit me until something else happened. I noticed something else, a subject I'm not expert in, which is politics. And in a city I no longer know very well, New York City. About 6 years ago, I was with a colleague in the theater district in New York, and I noticed, this is about 8th Avenue, if those of you are familiar with New York and what it used to look like. And I noticed there were no Coke bottles in the gutters, there were no newspapers strewn around, there were no unmentionables, nobody was yanking at me for money. And I mentioned it to my colleague, who's a confirmed New Yorker. He said, oh yes, this is our new mayor Giuliani, and there's been a dramatic change in the city. You know, that it was his, everybody was grateful to him for his policy for improving the quality of life in the city. And I met this in ensuing visits. I met this enthusiastic comment repeated many times. Clearly, Giuliani had become the most popular mayor since Friello LaGuardia. As an amusing aside, I cannot recount how many times people expressed their gratitude for his elimination of the windshield polishers, those characters who plunged at your car at the red light and smeared your windshield for a tip. I would not have thought that was an important contribution, but it was symbolic of many of the mayor's successes in making life more pleasant in the city. But as the years passed by, I began to notice an odd feature of the New York Times coverage of the mayor's activities. In simple words, they never had a good word to say about him. Not only were all comments negative, but even unrelated articles would be warped to include some disparaging reference to him or his administration. It was a totally opposite picture of the mayor that I gathered from acquaintances and the man in the street when I visited the city. Now, I'd have to qualify this observation, this is what I meant earlier, by noting that I only subscribe to the weekday Times. The weekend, the Sunday Times is just too much. And as I get older, I'm having trouble lifting it. But then, you see, I don't think statistically that has any effect on my observations. But it was at this point that I began to mentally review the longer series of articles, the about 15-year series on global warming. For me, personally, it began about 12 years ago with a phone call from William Stevens, a reporter from the New York Times. He explained that he had been assigned to do articles on global warming, and he was canvassing experts from all over. The interview began well enough until he explained that my name had been suggested as a representative of the, quote, minority, unquote. That is, those who believe that the effect of the increasing man-made CO2 in the atmosphere was not of immediate concern, and that no particularly countervailing action was needed or advisable at that time. With a certain naivete, I was patient with him in explaining that he was wrong. In fact, that I was part of the, quote, majority of informed scientists. And I want to repeat that for your benefit. I was then, and I still am now. And I was in very good position to know. I had chaired a National Academy of Science committee on the subject, the major one, that had produced a report on the subject in 1983. I had been one of the co-authors of the first hardcover book on the subject that was produced by the Jason Group. As director of the Scripps Institution Oceanography, I was in contact with about everybody in the business. I pointed out to Stevens the concerns of climatology leaders like Jerome Namias, perhaps the most respected person in the business at the time. Namias was outraged by the extreme statements of publicity seekers who were predicting sea level rises of 25 feet in decades. Floods, droughts, and many other climatic perturbations. And many were to occur within 40 years. Both he and Richard Lindzen, an equally distinguished atmospheric scientist and also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, actually wrote a letter to the President of the United States denouncing these rabble-rousers. Now this was a little bit before when Stevens telephoned me. As I said, I was in an excellent position to know where the majority opinion lay, but it became clear in time that Stevens was to ignore and mislabel this majority and mislead the public by semantic variations over time by his characterizations of the group I belonged to. The majority of serious workers at the time, or today for that matter, did not refute the point that addition of CO2 to the atmosphere would change the Earth's climate. However, it remains a question of how much, which region, when and which effects would be harmful, and which would be beneficial. None of this aspect ever shows in Stevens' articles, especially the benefits questions. Now, the satellite temperature measurements, you've heard about these. What is interesting is that about the time Stevens took on the responsibility, a new and far better method of determining the average temperature of the Earth was developed. From the very outset, any reasonable person, certainly scientists, could infer that the method is far superior to the time series that had been laboriously constructed and is the basis for much of today's discussion of climate change. The conventional method is a series constructed from direct temperature methods at thousands of sites all over the world. Many of the measurements on land have to be corrected for urbanization, that is the effect of the heat island built around the site by the growth of population and industry. This is not an easy correction to make, and further has been, believe it or not, contaminated by a subjective rejection of data that almost always from a site that shows a decline in temperature. This is incidentally published. This time series, the one that's the basis for much of the discussion, has one virtue, that it does cover a century. But it loses much of its value, as you heard before, and several times, because it samples the surface of the Earth in very variable fraction. There are large areas, particularly over the ocean, that are not measured. There are similar areas on land where the measurements are sparse compared to, say, those in the United States and Western Europe. It's this series that demonstrates a 0.6 degree Celsius rise over the century that some interpret, as you know, as the effect of an increase of, in the atmosphere due to man's activity. This argument, as you heard again, has been severely diluted by the shape of the curve that shows a maximum about the year 1950 before starting up again. At the time, there even, now this is, I mentioned this last year in my talk. I don't know how many of you remember. Well, try to understand time. I became director of Scripps in '65. I started to learn the details of the climate problem in terms of CO2 not much later. And so I have in my office a series of slides showing the measurements, you see, as they went along. And I showed one last year, and it was very distinct. It was the best data of the time, part of the current data, and it showed a maximum and a drop, and serious people were predicting drop into an ice age, and there was even a book, major paragraphs, warning us to be prepared for a new ice age. I showed that slide last year because as the years went by, as director, I had to make talks like this, and I had more and more data, and now you know what the recent data looks like. Now, the problem is that, in simple language, the satellite measurements do not show the temperature rise, as you've heard, over this classical procedure. This disparity is very difficult to ignore, especially in favor of the satellite measurements. And one of the reasons is the one thermometer that is used is the ratio of the microwave emissions from oxygen molecules. And you can't get a closer definition thermodynamically of temperature, not based on mercury or anything else. The orbits cover the entire Earth without any gaps. Everything is covered, everything is measured, and with great frequency. There are no corrections for like those of urbanization. There are no rejections of data on a subjective basis or any other basis that I know of. And the answer is the temperature the last 20 years, as you've heard over and over again, is just flat. But there's another feature that is very peculiar. The classical measurements that you've heard so much about that show the 0.6 degree change only show the change for the nighttime measurements. You rarely hear about how the series, which is very easy to do, has been broken down to the nighttime measurements and the daytime measurements. The daytime measurements are flat. It's the nighttime measurements that rise. The reason I mention it is I specifically called the satellite people to ask them if it showed up in the satellite data in any way at all. And the answer is it does not. It does not. Nighttime and daytime data, flat. But the real clincher is the agreement of the satellite observations with the radiosonde measurements. These are measurements taken at many places in the world, most often at airports. But they're not as densely distributed as the surface measurements of the standard time series. These are temperature measurements from the ground up through most of the troposphere, the lower atmosphere. The satellite measurements of Chris and Spencer can be interpreted in the same way. And the agreement is excellent with the radiosonde measurements vertically and I could say horizontally in time. There can be no question that as the time length of the data stream increases, this will be the fundamental time series for discussion of climate change. Now, one of the reasons I talk about this, besides Mr. Stevens, as a working scientist, I was enormously impressed by the ingenuity and the cleverness of the two scientists in using the satellite data stream for a purpose originally unintended and at essentially no cost. It's the kind of research that normally wins prizes and memberships to major scientific academies for the researchers. However, because the answer did not agree with those of the modelers or the predictions of the climate extremists, they've been shunted to one side, the honors, the memberships, and so on. During the entire 21 period, Stevens, the reporter, consistently ignored these powerful results. Only recently has he touched upon them, and only because the IPCC, about which you've heard a good deal, has been unable to ignore the satellite results. Somehow, that group has managed to declare the two series in agreement, although the satellite temperature results are flat in time and the classical curve rises, with a bump, of course. Now, Stevens just was totally uninterested. Satellite sea level measurements. You heard about, oh, perhaps not in detail. The most persistent disaster forecast is the rise in sea level and its possible adverse effect. In a vague and intuitive and unscientific sense, it's been touched on a number of times in the talks. One might think a rising global temperature will cause the melting of glaciers and polar ice, thus making a rise in sea level. You know, simple thinkers like the President of the United States and the Vice President think this way. In fact, of course, if that were the only phenomenon involved, that would be the case. For example, if the western Antarctic ice sheet were to melt completely, the sea level would change about 7 feet. This particular possibility has been reviewed thoroughly because there is good evidence that in geological time, the western Antarctic ice sheet has disappeared. But the conclusion today has been looked at very thoroughly that this is not likely to happen in the near future. But sea level change caused solely by the melting of glacial and polar ice due to increased average temperature is much too limited an approach to the question. Another source of sea level rise is the thermal expansion of the surface layer of the ocean due to temperature change. Given a temperature change, this is one of the easier calculations. A 1 degree Celsius change increase corresponds to 10 centimeters of ocean rise. However, many of the climate models also show, as you heard earlier, an increased precipitation that could result in increased polar ice that would balance or even exceed the melting. But more interesting, and a lot of fun for me, is one could say fascinating, is another of man's interventions, the giant dam. The Yangtze River Dam, when filled, corresponds to 15 millimeters, 1.5 centimeters of sea level. It's extraordinary, and you can play on that. You can multiply it for reasons I won't go into. But filling that dam will change the level of the ocean. Soon it takes 10 years to fill. You pick your number, 1 millimeter a year. That, you see, works opposite to global warming. It could be used as an excuse for why we don't see sea level rise. Except we draw water from huge underground reservoirs, like the Ogallala Reservoir, and we throw that into the atmosphere, and that works the other way, by about the same amount. Now, I mention all of this because I want to say this is a personal remark. This is great fun. To the kind of working scientist I used to be in the laboratory, discussing things like this, and putting them together, and discussing these ideas were great. Now, the subject is taboo. It's taboo for another reason. I'll come to my conclusion before I say it, because in fact there's no discernible sea level rise. All of these pluses and minuses seem to add up to 0. There are probably others that I don't think about. A former EPA estimate as a basis for comparison, this was a published formal estimate, was a 7-foot rise for a doubling of the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration at the then current projection of 50 years in the future. This is a rate rise, just as a figure, of 4 centimeters a year, or 40 millimeters a year. But now we have a remarkable, very powerful technique for measuring the rate of change of sea level and testing these projections. This is the Topex Poseidon satellite system, a joint US-France operation. It has been in operation for about 10 years. With the remarkable, from a conservative point of view, absolutely remarkable. I really felt when the program started that it really wasn't worth it. It was not going to do better than about 30 or 40 millimeters, you see, sensitivity. It actually, and the people involved, it's an international team, several in this country and several abroad, have actually made these measurements so if you average over several years to a sensitivity of 1 millimeter rise a year. Now, you can guess what the result has been. Over the 10-year period, the essential change in sea level has been 0. Of course, you know, once something like that happens, then you see worrying about the Yangtze River Dam or the big dam that's almost full in Turkey and the dam they're going to build in India. There's one every few years now. There's no sea level problem. There just isn't any. Now, you can say very little, if any, of these Topex-Poseidon results have appeared in any of Mr. Stevens' articles in the New York Times. I think it's a great scientific breakthrough. There's essentially no mention of these results. In fact, it's what's really happened is there really is very little further discussion of sea level rise, except on the part of political leaders and uninformed speculators. The subject has been quietly dropped. But as I say, these team members will get no special honors. Now there's the carbon cycle. That's a fascinating one, because the flow of carbon between the atmosphere, the oceans, and the biosphere is one of the most, maybe the most important set of numbers in discussing environmental change in general. And it takes special emphasis in the case of global warming. A convenient union is a gigaton of carbon. This is 1,000 million tons of carbon, or if you prefer, 10 to the 15 grams of carbon. It's a convenient union. In 1 year, the exchange of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide between the oceans and the atmosphere is an example 100 gigatons. And it's a similar amount between the atmosphere and the forests, the world's forests. The total anthropogenic emissions of carbon each year is slightly more than 6. The reason I give you these numbers, as you can see, that the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere due to combustion is a very small amount compared to what's going back and forth between the atmosphere and the forest, the atmosphere and the oceans, and so on. And this is something that's very poorly understood by many environmentalists. You see, this comes up when they worry about the clear cutting in the Amazon, as an example, in the forests. Really, the amount of clear cutting that is done in terms of released carbon is very small compared to these numbers. It is a serious question, but not related to global warming in any way, but rather to habitat for species. Now, two of the very few good numbers in the study of global warming is what I mentioned earlier, the 6 gigatons a year that we put into the atmosphere. And then there's another number, and Scripps has had a very big role in this, my institution. 3 gigatons a year are what remain. In other words, you can measure that year by year, and you can calculate that the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing in terms of the weight of carbon by 3 units. In other words, half of what we put in. The other half, apparently, is taken up very rapidly, within a year or two, by the upper ocean. Now this, it's been exponential in shape for a long time, but in the last year it seems to be linear, which is a little surprising, because presumably it's supposed to parallel the growth of population and population activity. Now, for a long time, the geochemists insisted that 3 gigatons, the missing amount, absolutely went into the oceans, you see, and that meant that the world's forests, they remain constant in terms of content. But what's happened is, now we can directly measure the flow of this carbon into the, as to where it goes, how much goes into the ocean, I should say. And as a matter of fact, there are 2 very good methods of measuring it. The first one was about 10 years ago and published, reviewed, by a team led by 2 very good scientists, Tans and Takahashi, What they did was simple, incidentally very difficult, I might add, technically, but perfectly simple. They simply measured the partial pressure of carbon dioxide immediately above the surface of the ocean and immediately below. And if you have more above, it simply drives into the ocean in a linear fashion. They calibrate it, and they measured in many places over the ocean. They're still doing it. And remarkably, they ended up with the result that not 3, but only 1 gigaton went into the ocean. 2 are missing. Well, the usual thing happened. The other side, I was going to use a bad word, the other side, you see, immediately start to pound away on them. They do it automatically. Oh, no, you should have seen it. But they couldn't eliminate it. They beat them down from 2 to 1. It was almost like bargaining in a bazaar in the Mideast. You know, it's not an exaggeration. You should read it. What happened, however, is the measurements still clearly indicate that 2 of these units are missing. And furthermore, what they deduced was, now they use some oceanography that's too complicated to explain, and they of course that meant it went on land. Where else was it going to go? And it had to be the forests. And they deduced that it was in the northern hemisphere, using the current systems of the ocean. Then, not too long ago, about 2 years ago, is it? You probably remember, Sarmiento and his group had a totally different way of doing it, rather simple in concept, not easy again, but straightforward and direct. They simply measured the CO2 of the atmosphere up north and south on the east coast of the North American continent and on the west coast of the North American continent. And as you know, the prevailing winds are west to east, and we know how much. And so they figured, you know, how much carbon was coming in and how much carbon was going out. And do you want to guess how much they found was missing? Exactly. 2 gigatons. And that raises all kinds of difficulties. First of all, it was really wonderful because I should mention another thing. There was another set of observations for the United States I was involved in, and so is my colleague, Dr. Singer, and that's NAPAP, gosh, I never remember, the National Assessment Program. Is it on acid rain? I don't remember. But it was a $10 million, $0.6 billion, I guess, program ordered by the Congress to study acid rain. That's one of the chapters in my book, but I'm not talking about that today. The important thing is that their conclusion, serious conclusion, because damage to forests was very important, their conclusion was a flat-out statement that the forests in the United States are in better condition today than they have ever been in historical times. And that fits, you see, this business of this growth of 2 gigatons a year. You see, really Canada and the United States, but it's primarily the United States. Of course, there are a lot of implications of this number, because this is something the whole class of environmentalists don't want to believe. They'll tell you about the tremendous destruction of the forests that are going on. In fact, quite the opposite. And there's another, well, there's so many interesting anti-conclusions, but the one, you know, for today is, of course, this is a striking benefit. You see, I don't want to go in detail what you've heard about a great deal. By straining something awful, and by using the most powerful political influences, and by considerable cheating and striking out what other people have written, as you know, you end up with statements like, maybe, perhaps, slightly, there is some discernible effect of man on the climate because of the introduction of CO2. It's so weak, it's unbelievable, even if you believed it. But here you have a clear-cut evidence that you're improving your forests at the rate of 2 gigatons of carbon a year. You would think that that would be a big excitement, something that a Mr. Stevens would have as a striking item. He didn't. However, that's not quite true. In hitting the computer, there's an article I haven't read, and this is very difficult for me because nobody's completely a devil. Apparently, very recently, he has written on it. But the headline, he may not be responsible for the headline, so I'm being very careful, but the headline says, ascribes the improved forests due to the increased temperature, not to the increased absorption of carbon or increased photosynthesis. But I haven't read the article, and even if I did, perhaps he's not to blame, but the headline writer is. And while I'm mentioning, I'm coming to my last bit, and while I mention Mr. Stevens in this slightly favorable light, incidentally, I learned that he's just retired. Yes. Well, I'm wondering, I'll tell you how I found out. I was trying to get this data, or some easy way of getting the old articles, you see. There isn't any, but in the process, the New York Times or somebody told us that he has just left within the last month or two, or something. Well, anyway, oh God, that got me off the subject. There's a chapter I would love to put in the book, and I may anyway. I don't know how many of you follow the heart-rending saga of the songbirds. Does that ring a bell or a sound or a chirp? Oh, you missed one of the most heart-rending things that turned out to be excellent. But that's another chapter in my book. It's a similar fake that went on, not as serious, as the global warming. And people wrote, these were real scientists, wrote articles in different common organs of publicity about the disappearance of the songbirds. And it really tore my heart out. You know, I'm a sucker over and over again for these things. And now it turns out that it's absolutely flatly wrong. And apparently, I have to say, it really kills me in Stephen's favor. Apparently, he picked up the fact that the story was nonsense. But put that aside. Now, this is what I'm getting up to, really, the question of semantics and what you do, an experienced journalist does. You see, what bothered me the most, I just reviewed all of this, so I tried to pick three, actually there are four, I maybe forgot to mention. The fourth one, Dr. Singer also mentioned, was the question of the resident time of this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Instead of being several thousand years, it's only perhaps 150 years, but I won't discuss that. In other words, as I see it, there were four major breakthroughs worth serious reporting in this period that were totally ignored in these 50 or so articles that he wrote. The semantics. What bothered me over the 15 years was the calling, the name calling, that took the place of rational discussion on the part of the paid environmentalists, and I mean the paid environmentalists, and their journalistic and political representatives. Stevens was unable to accept my assertion that I was really part of the majority, and would usually refer to scientists like myself as the minority, over and over again. I don't recall his using the really nasty word naysayers, but that was used a good deal, you know. Sometimes I wish some of my colleagues, I didn't seem to have the nerve to call the other ones the yaysayers, you know, but it wasn't my style. But you know, the whole thing was close to a conspiracy. There was a major hearing on this subject before the House Science Subcommittee. I remember, you were there, weren't you, Sally, that big hearing? And it didn't go very well for the administration supporters, who overemphasized the immediacy and the seriousness of global warming. And to repair the damage, the minority staff prepared their own discussion of the subject. Their report referred to the, quote, fringe group, unquote, me. Those who testified in the same vein, you know, as myself. But I'll tell you why it was particularly painful. The report was signed, it was written, and was signed by the minority leader, the former chairman, actually, of the committee, George Brown, Representative George Brown of Riverside. Now, as far as I was concerned, he was no ordinary person. He was a good friend, somebody I had known for 33 years, you know, and we had great respect for one another. And it really was absolutely shameful to see how a senior legislator, a knowledgeable one, can be so humiliated by having his arm twisted, you see, in this political fashion by an administration to put his, you know, name to something like that, addressed to me personally. It was really shocking. But an interesting change took place. We have to be very grateful to Art Robinson for taking the poll that you've all heard about so much of the scientific community. He mailed out about, what was it, 17,000 questionnaires on the Kyoto protocols. I heard that he got back more than 17,000 eventually. I don't know exactly what. It's remarkable enough. Those of you that have any experience at all in mailings, you know, if you get back 10%, you're lucky. He got back more than 100%, as I understand. You know all about this, you know. But what I'm talking about is the subtle effect. You see, this, of course, came up. How did they pound him? He had his own article on the subject, and it was in a format, probably a computer format, the same one that the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science used. So what happened? The Stevenses et al. Pounded him for the format. They never once mentioned the number 17,000 or this extraordinary community support from the fringe group. That was never mentioned, including our friend Mr. Stevens, you know. Now, what happened? But I do know that he understood it. I do know that Stevens got the implication of the 17,000. Why? Because he stopped using the word majority. At that point, almost immediately, he used the word, what was it again? Consensus. All of a sudden, majority, fringe, all of that disappeared. But now he would refer to consensus thinking. But somehow that didn't fit, you see, this 17,000. So then he switched, finally, in his last things, to quote mainstream, which of course was a sort of trickle had he defined the membership, but he never did. He just talked about the mainstream. And that made honest journalism, because he no longer said majority or minority, and he had his own particular mainstream, namely his own pals that he'd been spleening. In other words, I have an epilogue here, and which is simply saying that here you had these 4 or so major breakthroughs in that period. Somebody for the New York Times, a great newspaper, writing articles on this over 15 years and essentially ignoring these breakthroughs. And of course taking the opposing point of view, and he had us ignoring people. He did actually write an article on Linsen, but of course it got to be very complex and diffuse the issues and so on. The other chapters I'd like to write about, you see, I'm not going to talk about today because, first of all, you heard about them from somebody who's very expert, are acid rain, the thinning of the ozone layer, and malaria DDT. Now, malaria DDT, I'm going to close this. Just thinking about it, is a subject that I know a good deal about. Many of you know a good deal about. I want to write about it, you see, from the same viewpoint of the terrible treatment it's received in political circles and the newspapers. But it brings me back, I can't tell you how many years, when I knew nothing about the subject. Tomorrow, you're going to see and hear Professor Edward Teller, somebody I've known since I was 19 years old and have interacted with on and off in a whole variety of things, basic physics, atomic warfare, defense, and we were colleagues for many years in the physics department in Berkeley. And I don't know, he probably won't remember. One day at our weekly seminar tea, he came in and gave me a copy, it was 1956 or 7, of a United Nations paper on their attempt to find a substitute for DDT for malaria. I remember the paper very well. I no longer have it. It was about 30 pages, very thorough article. And, you know, he's a very remarkable man. In 1955, he already was up on the subject, and it was quite clear that his conclusions were the same, at least as what I would have today, that there was really no substitute for DDT. Anyway, thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
Couple little tidbits you might be interested in. A paper by Klaus Wittke, U of H professor of meteorology.
At Hawaii.
In Hawaii, yes.
Yeah, I know him quite well.
Oh, very good. I'll say hello for you. Anyway,
he's a very good, he's one of our outstanding physical oceanographers.
Yeah, he's sort of Mr. El Nino. I think he was the one.
That's quite correct. That's quite correct. Sea level, El Nino, that's right.
Right. Well, anyway, he pointed out that he's taken some meter readings in that area, and that the measured water level rise at Christmas Island apparently is the same as Topex, 0. However, the sea level rise in Hilo Harbor down to Hawaii is about 4 millimeters per year. The reason being that the great mass of Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea is pushing the island down into the mantle. The point is, we live in a dynamic planet.
Oh, that's certainly true.
I just wanted to make...
Oh, well, listen, you see, there was a period when I was called to be on public radio around the country, and depending on, like at New Orleans, they were scared silly, you see, that's a problem there, about the sea level rise. But of course, it turns out that the pumping of oil and other things had such a more dramatic effect than any change in sea level that, you know, they were being scared totally unnecessarily by the point you're making. But then there's another one. These things are so complicated, I like. The Nile Delta. I'm not a very good geologist, so this is sort of by rote. The Nile Delta, you know, Alexandria, on each side has two faults. And Alexandria, in fact, is sinking at quite a rate, much greater than anything that we're both talking about. But by coincidence, again, these numbers are funny. It had never been important because before the big dam, the silt deposit roughly matched the sinking. Now that the dam has been built, you talk about man's intervention in a lot of ways. We do things. You see, the delta is sinking.
And one more statistic you might be interested in. I recently attended a briefing by the architect who was designing the new buildings at Pole Station, Antarctica. The geodesic dome down there, that's at the pole now, is expected to collapse in the not too far future because of the buildup of snow exceeding its ability to carry the load. The new dormitories there look like from Star Wars. They're all standing on pedestals, on legs, like so. And the reason for that is that this is the architect, he says this is their design criteria. The elevation of the snowpack at Pole Station today is growing 8 inches a year.
Did you know that? I'll tell you, I'm glad I got out. I was there for 24 hours once. I got out in time.
Sir, I don't recall the details, but I think in Science and Nature there have been articles published recently to the effect that the ocean is really hiding all the effects of global warming and that there's going to be a big surprise of ocean effects. Do you have any comment on that?
I'll tell you, you see, yes, you're quite right. I still don't understand the article. I read it about 5 times. There's huge volumes of data that haven't been looked at carefully because they are so huge. And people are, you know, going over the old data that are measured by Scripps ships and other oceanographic vessels and so on. And I'm not going to explain it because they don't understand it, but they saw some increases in temperature. But the same effect that I was mentioning before happened. Before the data was even out, what I will call the yaysayers jumped on it to show that eventually the Earth is going to heat up. I got the opposite sign looking at the data. In other words, they said that the ocean temperature was higher than one expected, had increased, and so therefore, somehow the ocean was going to give up this heat, and we're going to get higher surface temperature. I just didn't understand it, and it's disappeared. I mean, speculation on it has disappeared. But you're quite right, that article did come up. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question having to do with the media and, you know, science and so forth. Now, you know, the papers have, you know, the editorial matter in there, but they also have advertising, so does the broadcast media. Now, governments these days are spending a lot of money broadcasting all kinds of paid advertisements. A lot of advocacy ones on so-called scientific issues in terms of smoking and AIDS and drug policy and whatever. Now, the big difference is that there's no truth in advertising laws applied to government advertising.
Or any advertising, but that...
Well, no, there is in terms of commercial advertising where you actually have to prove some claims. What do you think about the idea of actually adopting some laws about truth in advertising?
Well, the Congress tries. In fact, you raised something that maybe my colleagues can join me in discussing. In fact, the Congress is sensitive to that. I'm talking now about global warming. Because you see, you're speaking about a $2.5 billion, I think it is, industry now. And so the money goes to the DOE, you know, to the APA, you name it, NOAA. Apparently what's happened, more or less at the direction of the White House, some of this money has been funded. The trick you do in government is you set up public sensitivity seminars with government money around the country. So there are seminars going on explaining to the public, you don't see these, you see, explaining why this is bad or that's bad. In this particular case, you can imagine what these seminars do. The Congress actually watches for this, but it's like, you know, the little boy in the dike doesn't have enough fingers. In other words, what you're saying is correct. But even with vigilance on the part of the Congress, you'd be surprised how much money are being spent by the appropriate agencies in these, what seem these harmless public seminars, public meetings, you know, groups that get together, labor councils. You make them up. You see PTAs and so on, and of course always with the party line. If the Congress can't control it, you know, I don't know what you do.
You talk about a lot of the bad, the press doing a bad job.
No, I'm talking about the New York Times.
Oh, the New York Times.
No, don't let's...
Well...
No, I'm being fair, there's a reason.
The newspaper, our local newspaper at home is owned by a company that owns probably 300 local or regional papers. And it's gotten to be such a joke that as you read it in there, it must be a lie. I mean, you just...
Well, that's another way of getting the news. Just change the sign.
Well, you about have to. I have noticed, though, that with the disregard that local paper, as well as a bunch of others, are treated, you know, you see it in there and you say, it's got to be a lie. And it's generally true to say that. A lot of the technical publications, I get 4 or 5 different ones in my trade, and then we have the ag sector to deal with. And those are accorded a little more, I guess you could call it respect. And yet, they seem to use that respect to carry the lie to depths that are almost unbelievable. And now you have all these organizations springing up on a local basis that we made a list, a friend of mine made a list of all the public information officers that are related to a lot of local squawk boxes, you might say, and I think there's been like a 10-fold increase in the last 3 years. And they're all on the radio, and a lot of them are quasi-government organizations, or they're doing it for free of charge or whatever. So that's just kind of an observation. A lot of the technical journals, where you tend to think they'll be better about reporting the facts, if anything, they seem to be a little more of a loose cannon about the affair, at least in the ag and the transportation industries.
It's interesting.
Most of what they do anymore, most of the reporting and most of the editorial policies.
I'd like to get to your first point. It's interesting. One newspaper that I think is fair for an odd reason is the Wall Street Journal. Let me explain why. As far as I can make out, the news part is on the left side, but the editorials are on the right. The average is 0, or whatever you'd say. It's very peculiar, as if the two sides never talk to one another, you know, and it has been in a global warming issue also. So I consider the Wall Street Journal not a bad paper, although for it's. Oh, you got me. Oh, I got to watch it. I don't read.
Thank you.
Fred?
Bill, you alluded very briefly to the acid rain problem. Perhaps I should mention here for the record that you were the chairman of a group.
A very distinguished group. Fred was a member.
That delivered a report to the White House, which I think made a big impact, because this is the report that I think that first suggested the idea of emission trading for SO2, for sulfur dioxide, which was subsequently adopted. And at least, whatever you may think of the necessity of reducing SO2 emission, at least it lowered the cost to electric utilities and therefore to the ratepayers. But also I mentioned that the idea of emission trading does not work for CO2, for the Kyoto Protocol, although many people believe it should, but it doesn't. I do want to mention one more thing, and that is that Bill Nierenberg, as the director of the Scripps Institute, was preceded by an equally distinguished scientist, Roger Revelle. Many of you have heard his name. He's referred to as the father of the greenhouse effect, or the greenhouse warming. I want to tell you that we knew Roger quite well, and had the privilege of working with him, as of course Bill did over many years. Roger Revelle is mentioned in Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, as his mentor, his guru on global warming. And it came as a considerable embarrassment to Mr. Gore during the '92 campaign, when it was brought out that Roger Revelle was equally skeptical about global warming as Bill Nierenberg, some of us. So maybe Roger Revelle should also be referred to as a fringe scientist.
Oh yes, in today's nomenclature, he would be.
Roger referred to started the series of measurements that established the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the measurements at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. But he always referred to it as an interesting geophysical experiment. He says, gee, wouldn't it be nice to find out what happens to the planet if CO2 keeps on increasing? We were not the least bit alarmed about it. And in fact, in 1988, when there was this great alarm about global warming raised in the Congress, he wrote a letter to Senator Worth and to others saying, don't get excited, let's wait another couple of decades to see if anything happens.
Absolutely.
Don't rush into anything, for heaven's sakes. Look before you leap.
Yeah, it's nice to mention Roger, probably shouldn't. Let me say something about what I think happened. You see, Roger had a freshman course that was very popular. He was away from Scripps for 10 years at Harvard, did a number of things, but he gave this freshman course on environmental matters, and a certain fraction of it was in global warming. And I know something about it because when he got back to San Diego, he didn't have to teach, but he did. He taught that course, and my son took that course. And I might say my son was not a great scholar. He thought Roger was great. But then I was able to extrapolate back and see what happened. When Roger was teaching, as far as I could make out, he was a freshman at Harvard with Gore, Gore was a freshman taking exactly the same course. You know, we don't change our courses over a 10-year period. It's the same course. And it was a great course then, a great course when my son took it. It was clear to me from what Gore said, my personal interaction with him in the book, that he totally misunderstood everything that Roger Revelle said, which is a typical freshman phenomenon. Unfortunately, he became Vice President of the United States.
Question about the New York Times. Don't they have the motto, all the news that
Fit to print? Yeah. I think they still do, as far as I know, in the head.
I think this should have been a tip-off because they've always...
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not an expert, you know, in journalism. We learn a little bit about it when we're in college. But I remember discussing it about a paper that's not worth discussing, the San Diego Union in San Diego, with a retired admiral, a very distinguished one, a general, excuse me, who was chairman of their editorial board. You know, at a certain period, it isn't anymore. And I complained at that time, I counted in the New York Times or them, that 1/2 of the articles on the first 2 pages were signed articles. You see, I was brought up that a signed article is a column, that news was to be an unsigned article. And I tell you, when I was young, a signed article in the New York Times was rare, you know, very rare. Now, every article is signed for about 3 pages back. Well, you can argue, you see, what's the point? If they're signed, the guy can say any damn thing he pleases. It is not necessarily news. It's his opinion. And that spoiled. I actually made that inquiry of this general, and he agreed with me, but you know, even he couldn't do anything about it. It was an inexorable change. And now, whether it's my home newspaper or the New York Times, all the articles are signed.
One of the precedents I mentioned, do you recall a New York Times foreign correspondent named Walter Durante?
Yes.
And he was classic in the 30s for being Stalin's apologist. And when Roosevelt finally recognized the Soviet Union, Durante was invited there. And of course, during all the trials and purges, always wrote articles apologizing for Stalin, and often quoting, to excuse this, he quoted that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. So I think Durante sort of set the stage for much of
you get that. Well, you know, times change. There were 2 science writers, and both named Lawrence. God, what's the matter with me? The one about the time of, he wasn't bad, at the time of the nuclear you know, the opening of the nuclear age, but spelled Laurence, and he wasn't bad, he was knowledgeable. But then there was one I grew up with, Lawrence. Why do I forget his first name? It's terrible. He died about 2 or 3 years ago. He was very good. He would not have written the way Stevens did, you see. But times have changed.
One more bit of history. The New York Daily Post was Horace Greeley's newspaper. Is that correct?
I think you're right.
If my memory serves me right, and it's one of the most fascinating bits of history, is that that Horace Greeley had a foreign correspondent, not Durante, but a guy that asked for, I think he was getting $5 a piece for each item that was used in the paper. He asked for a raise and was refused, so he turned to labor organizing and rebel around New York. His name was Karl Marx. And John Kennedy commented on the fact that what importance and what effect newspaper publishers had many times unintended in this country.
I didn't know that Karl Marx had, but there's lots of stories like that are worse. Ho Chi Minh, people don't realize, actually spent 1 year in New York City working as a waiter. And at the end of the war, I did something I knew, that's another side of my life, getting involved in that history going back to 1890. And at the end of the war, we really weren't very bright. He was a great admirer of the U.S. He actually approached the U.S., unfortunately, at too low a level, through the CIA, or its equivalent then, to try to develop a liaison with the U.S. And it wasn't even turned down. You know, that's what happens if you're at a low level. Well, you get these things, but I didn't know that about Karl Marx because that's not, I just read a recent history of him that was damning enough, I might add.
Well, did the history you read mention the fact that Karl Marx was a strong fan of Abraham Lincoln?
No.
Sent him a telegram on his re-election.
No.
He was president of a big European Union.
No.
So history.
What I did read about is that all of his data was either falsified or old hat. Nobody ever reads the book critically.
Howard Long. Dr. Nierenberg, do you have any suggestions how to better handle the following, which seems to indicate that medical journals, as well as daily newspapers, censor politically incorrect scientific truths? In this situation, a few months ago, the Journal of the American Board of Family Practice had an article on hazards of radiation in high-altitude flying. Turns out the author was a consultant to the employees of airlines, and the article had projected by the linear no threshold theory risks to those employees from flying at high altitude, and the passengers flying much at high altitude, scaring the public. I wrote them with the co-signature of Dr. Myron Polakov, member of the Regulatory Commission, who's spoken here, and whose article on molecular biology and the demise of the linear no threshold theory also attracted the attention of our classmates 2 weeks ago, and also with co-signature of health physicist Louis Helgeson. In other words, real authorities on reviewing all of the data that Dr. Lucky and others, Dr. Buckeride, presented. We did it very concisely, and so they had no excuses apparently from an editorial reason, but the editor, John Guyman, refused it as expected, and did not, this is what troubled me most, did not even send a copy of it for comment to the author. Well, I did later, and that's how I learned you never received a copy of it, but the author seemed to defend his article very poorly, but the editor remained willing to censor without feeling any need to, even with a certified mailing and commentary from authorities, give any explanation for rejecting a correction of something that was really bound to scare the public. How can one handle that situation?
I don't know. I'll tell you two things, a personal one. When critical of scientific writings and results, I'm sort of usually in my role as a nuclear physicist, something I grew up and is very rigid. But I realized a long time ago, this is a very general remark, that I can't apply the same attitude towards medicine. It's a very different field. You can't, well, I don't have to tell you what you all know. You can't experiment on people, you know, and the data is very difficult and so on. That's a simply general remark, my personal attitude. So I approach the medical things in rather a different way. But I can cite, I don't know what one does about it. I use a name, we've been using it before. He was your principal speaker last year, Professor Seitz, one of our greatest living scientists of the generation that just preceded me. He's really extraordinary, more than most of you might realize as a scientist. I could go, like the head of the National Academy, he wrote the key book that put our country ahead of the rest of the world in solid state physics, and you name it, is modern theory of the science. Just go on and on. President of Rockefeller University, and a brilliant physicist, tremendous publications. Maybe, well, I shouldn't go on and on. He wrote, this must be 10 years back, he wrote a letter to Nature, probably on something related to the subjects we discussed today. You know, usually when you send something in, you get a postcard back, we received. He didn't even get that back. He didn't even get an acknowledgement. And several years later, I banged into the editor, whom I knew very well, the editor-in-chief, and he lost control of the journal. You see, you may not have been dealing with the editor. Apparently Nature is now in the hands of a bunch of young Turks, and the editor is for nothing, and they control what's published and what's not published with a distinct political view. And just not even acknowledging the receipt, you know, of an article from Professor Seitz is a most extraordinary thing. So I don't know what it is you do. You know, after a while, you just don't trust those journals.
Get on the internet. Let everybody know.
The internet is very good that way, absolutely.
In my dim memory of several decades ago, I remember that Herman Dinsmore, who was the London editor of the New York Times, in disgust, got out of his employment with the New York Times and wrote a book. And he subtitled the motto of the New York Times, "All the news that fits to print." The title of his book was, "All the News That Fits."
Well, it's almost as good as my title.